Thoughts on the Eastern idea of moving away from excessive thinking into the awareness beyond thinking, removing it from the driver's seat to be used more as a tool. Yeah, well, I thought a lot about this in relationship to a couple of ancient ideas. The one Mesopotamian idea, characterization of Marduk, who was the highest Mesopotamian deity. It was Marduk who carved up the goddess of chaos, Tiamat, into pieces and made the world out of her pieces. So Marduk is the force that confronts chaos and builds habitable order, like the Logos in Genesis. And one of Marduk's attributes was that he had eyes all the way around his head. Then there's Horus, the Egyptian god, who's the famous eye. And Horus is really a deification of attention, I would say. And there's a difference between attention and thinking. Like, let me give you an example. So thinking seems to be instrumental, mostly. People also often say to me, well, what's your strategy when you go into an interview? And the answer is, well, I don't have a strategy when I go into an interview because I'm there to have a conversation. And I'm not sure where the conversation will go, and I'm willing to let it go wherever it goes. I'm not there to sell books, although I'm perfectly happy if more books sell, because obviously I wrote a book and I want people to read it, and there's a whole enterprise behind it, and so it's also my responsibility to do the marketing properly. But I'm not going to do these interviews to sell books or to promote myself, or I don't have a strategic goal in mind, except that I'm going to have a conversation and I'm going to say what I think and take the consequences, because I assume that if I say something and I believe it's true, then the consequences are as positive as they can be, regardless of how they look at the time. And that's an issue of faith, because I believe that the habitable order is generated by spoken truth. I believe that. I think that's the truest thing I know. And so I go into the interview, and I did this in my clinical practice, and I try to do this when I'm talking to people too, is that I'm not thinking about where the conversation is going or what point I want to make or what I want the outcome to be. Any of that, I just let that go. You know, it's within this broader framework of assuming that the truth is the most effective means of progressing. And then I pay attention. And what happens when you pay attention is that while you're watching a person, this is a great treatment for social anxiety, by the way, because if you're socially anxious, you tend not to pay attention to the person. Pay attention to who you're talking to. Watch them like a hawk, like not paranoid or anything like that, and not too intently because you'll make them uncomfortable, but intently. Pay attention to what they're saying, to how they look, to their facial gestures, all of that. Look at their face and watch and listen and try to understand what they're saying. And what you'll see is that, well, questions pop into your minds like, well, I didn't understand what you said. Can you clarify that? And sounds like you mean this. Is this what you mean? But not in a, I'll put you on the spot because I think you're wrong sort of way, but in a clarification sort of way. And all of that's attention. And so when I'm doing clinical work with people, and this is the reason I quit, by the way, about a year ago, is because I was starting to get distracted. I had a rule, which was, you have an hour with me and I do nothing but pay attention to you. I'm not thinking about what I want to accomplish. I'm not thinking about the problems in my life. I'm not distracted. And I listen to you and I ask questions when I don't understand. And if a thought occurs to me while I'm paying attention to you, then I'll tell you what it is. You see, and that's using awareness primarily and thinking secondarily. Like, I don't think, well, here's how I want to cure this person and I'm going to maneuver them into certain responses by using these communicative tools. I think I'm going to pay attention to this person. We're going to discuss where we're going and why. I'm going to listen to what they say. And then when they're talking, things are going to occur within me. I'm going to see images and thoughts are going to emerge from the background. And then I'll share them. Not always, because I usually have more thoughts than can be shared. But if a thought comes up and it seems like an interesting reaction to what the person just said, then I'll just tell them and sort of without commitment to it. And it's usually, okay, you just said this, and so this question emerged, so we need to straighten that out because I'm confused. Or you said this and I had this image, or you said this and this thought came to mind. So that's one person's reaction to the way that you're conducting yourself at the moment. So thinking is instrumental. I outlined this in, I think it's Rule 7, do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. If you do what's expedient, you have a short-term conscious goal in mind and you try to bend everything towards that end. But if you're pursuing what's meaningful, then you just pay attention to what's going on and you react with truth. And I think that's a much better way of living as far as I'm concerned. It's a much more powerful way of living. It means you have to confront things right then and there, which is, I suppose, why so many of my interviews have been, in some sense, confrontational, because people will impose a thinking agenda on the flow of the conversation. This is especially true in the mainstream media. It happened again recently with BBC's Hard Talk. They impose an agenda on the conversation, and then that just doesn't work out very well because I'm paying attention and I will object to the agenda. Not because I have a different agenda, except for what I said, which is that I want to say what I think. I want to say as truthfully as I can what I actually am thinking in this more abstracted and detached sense and see what happens. So it's a hard thing to clarify because you might say, well, Dr. Peterson, you just said you want to say what you're thinking, but it's not exactly the same thing. It's not like I'm thinking strategically. I'm listening, thoughts emerge, and I say them. I'm not putting spin on things. I'm not trying to manipulate the conversation in any particular way. And again, the reason for that is because I decided a long time ago, probably 30 years, that there was no more effective way of dealing with a complex situation than to try to say what you believe to be true. And not to manipulate it, none of that. Because those are all lies as far as I'm concerned, that kind of manipulation and spin.
The things that's happened to me over the last year, somewhat surprisingly, is that I've been invited to speak in front of a lot of conservative groups. And a lot of them were conservative groups that were composed of young people. And that was interesting, you know, because conservatism isn't something that's necessarily all that easy to sell to young people because they tend not to be that conservative to begin with. And conservatism also tends to have quite a lot to do with things that you shouldn't do instead of things that you might be allowed to do. And so there's a restrictive element of it that's also perhaps less attractive to young people than it might be. People do tend to get more conservative as they get older, as their personalities shift. And so, but what I saw was very interesting because I saw, and this was particularly true of young men, and I haven't quite puzzled that out yet, but you know, I would talk about what was going on in the universities and what I thought might constitute a reasonable antidote to that, and that was not only in the universities but also politically, and that was both the adoption of responsibility instead of the incredible and constant stress that's being placed on rights, and also the responsibility of the citizen to speak forward what he or she believed to be true, or at least to not speak what they knew to be false, which is at least a good place to start. And one of the things I found so remarkable was that this was actually a saleable message to young people. And that surprised me because, you know, you wouldn't necessarily think that you would turn a lot of lights on in a young audience by talking to people about truth and responsibility. I think if you went to a marketing agency and told them that that was going to be your political message to young people, they would tell you to go back and, you know, flesh out another plan, sketch out another plan. But maybe young people have been talked to enough about rights for maybe about the next 15 decades. That's what I would think. And so maybe there's a hunger arising among young people for something that has a little bit more respectability, let's say, and a little bit more depth than the constant emphasis on doing whatever you want, whenever you want. Let's put it that way. The thing about that, and the thing about rights in general, the idea of rights is that rights don't really give you much direction, right? They tell you what you are in principle allowed to do, but they don't really tell you what you should do. And it actually turns out that you need to know what you should do because you need to do something, right? People are active, and our lives don't have any meaning without something to do and something that you should do. It can't just be something that you want to do. That's too shallow. There's no deep meaning. There's no enduring. There's no sustaining meaning in that. It's just impulsiveness, and maybe that's okay in some sense. Maybe that's entertaining, and maybe it's impulsively exciting and fun, and there's some utility in that for life. But life is a very difficult journey, let's say. It involves a lot of suffering, and it involves a lot of heavy existential weight, and you need to be able to put something of value up against that so that you can withstand your life, and you can stand up with some dignity, and you can contribute to your community, and you can feel that you're a worthwhile person, you know, in spite of all the things that you're doing wrong, and in spite of all the problems that you have. And so then people need to know what they should do, and one of the things they should do is take responsibility, and another thing they should do is try to tell the truth, because those two things help them live proper lives and then help society organize itself properly. And that's good for everyone.